Stuka, run for it!
If you have ever watched movies depicting the Second World War, or even played video games set in the conflict, you will be aware of the iconic Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, screaming into scenes with its infamous Jericho Sirens blaring. But how much do you actually know about the Stuka? Join me in this video as we dive in and take a look at one of the Second World War's most iconic aircraft. The Junkers Ju-87, more commonly known as the Stuka, a name devised from this German word, was a single-engine, two-seat dive bomber developed by the Junkers Aviation Company. Commonly known for its blaring Jericho trumpet sirens and providing close air support to German ground forces during the early years of the Second World War. Early development began as soon as 1927, under Hermann Pullman, with the construction of a Junkers K-47 for the Swedish military. After the rise to power by the Nazis, Pullman's proposal for a dive bomber for use by the German military would become fast-tracked. Although Henschel's HS-123 prototype had already been completed. Despite this, the German Aviation Ministry would pursue Pullman's design. Doubts would be raised over the effectiveness of dive bombing, especially with younger pilots in the Luftwaffe. However, the development would continue, and the importance of dive bombing was so far pressed to the extent that Ernest Udet would express a desire to equip all medium bombers with dive bombing capability. We would see this on early variants of the Ju-88. During trials in 1932, dual vertical stabilizers were added, as were dive brakes under its distinctive gull wings. Although initially intended to be powered by the British Rolls-Royce Kestrel, this did not sit well with the German Aviation Ministry, and Junkers suggested instead fitting Daimler-Benz DB600 inverted V12 engines. Although Junkers Jumo 210s were eventually selected. Service. The aircraft's trial of fire would come like many of the early war period during the Spanish Civil War, while seeing service with the German Condor Legion. Many problems would become apparent with the Stuka during this time, with the aircraft's fixed, spattered undercarriage often becoming entrenched in the mud of forward airfields. As well as this, the Ju-87's maximum payload at the time, 1,100 pounds, 500 kilograms, could only be fitted if the rear gunner vacated his seat in the rear of the aircraft. Due to this issue, the max payload was limited to only 550 pounds, 250 kilograms. Although a light bomb load, this allowed the aircraft to retain its rear protection, and thus increase its survivability. The first recorded attack on a Ju-87 would come during the 21st of January 1939. While a Stuka dive bombing shipping in the port of Barcelona was dived upon by a Russian-built Poliparkov I-15 biplane, piloted by Francesco Alvarez Jimenez, who claimed the Stuka had crashed as a result of his attack. This is disputed, as the Stuka was later able to land on a nearby beach, without crashing. Later the same month, Stukas denied the destruction of a bridge by Republican forces by strafing the sappers tasked with its destruction. During this attack, the Republican ground defenders, equipped with Soviet light machine guns, returned fire, hitting pilot Heinz Braun in both his legs and further injuring his gunner Albert Conrad. Their aircraft would later crash, seriously injuring both. These are reported to be the only two Stuka casualties of the war. The Spanish Civil War would prove invaluable training, not only for individual branches of the German military, but for specific tactics as well, and the combat that Stuka crews would endure would be no different. Although the Junkers aircraft was still yet to experience modern fighter resistance. In readiness for the German invasion of Poland in the September of 1939, all squadrons operating the Ju-87 would be moved to Germany's far eastern border. On the morning of the 1st of September, the German invasion would begin, with nearly 400 Stukas available for combat. It would be a Ju-87 that would claim the first aerial kill of the conflict, when Rotenführer Lieutenant Frank Nubert of 1st Sturzkampfgeschwader II shot down a Polish PZL P-11 fighter while it was taking off from a small airstrip outside of Blitzkrieg, with its pilot being killed. For the most part, Stukas operated in relative safety during the invasion, in part due to heavy fighter support provided by the Luftwaffe, as well due to the weak and for the most part archaic Polish Air Force, not having the means or ability to operate against such enemy aircraft with precise enough accuracy. In short, the German Air Force was running amok. In Norway and Denmark, the Stuka would operate with similar success, taking out strategic positions along the enemy lines, although the Germans were unable to employ Blitzkrieg tactics due to the highly mountainous and wooded terrain. Germany would invade both countries on the 9th of April 1940, and although Denmark would capitulate during the first day, Norway would continue to resist along with support from the British and French armies respectively. The first action from Stukas would come late in the first morning of the invasion, tasked to destroy the Oscarsburg fortress following the loss of the German cruiser Blucher, which had prevented the landings in Oslo through the Oslo fjord. STG-1 would find, bomb, and eventually beach the Norwegian destroyer Eger, not before losing 2 Stukas in the effort. By the time of the invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the accuracy and precision of dive bombing from Stukas had vastly improved. The Luftwaffe had learnt their failings to immediately knock out positions during the prior campaigns in Denmark and Norway, and had been using the phony war period to train and allow pilots to dive bomb with much more precise accuracy. It was during this campaign that the iconic and largely infamous Blitzkrieg would be put on full display for the British and French armies. Having broken through the Ardennes, the invading German armies fed off speed and full support from the air. In order for tanks, guns, and men to move up, the road ahead would first be cleared by waves of Stukas, cleaning enemy positions. If a unit ran into a particular problem, be it a tank, enemy troops held up in a fortified position, or be it a road full of refugees, one swift call to the Luftwaffe, and a couple of Stukas would soon arrive to assist with the predicament. With the Allied lines failing, and the British strategically pulling back, eventually to Dunkirk for the evacuations of Operation Dynamo, the Germans had been ordered to halt their advance. Although this is not to say that the menace of the Ju-87 in the air stopped. Allied holdouts, such as the port of Calais, and the retreating British and French at Dunkirk themselves, were under heavy bombardment, both night and day, largely from Stukas. During the invasion of the Low Countries and France, the Luftwaffe would, for the first time, experience high losses from Stuka crews. This would become a much recurring issue. Through the summer of 1940, in the heat of the Battle of Britain, the Germans would endure an incredibly high loss ratio from the Stuka, to the extent that the aircraft had effectively been withdrawn from attacks on the United Kingdom by the end of August. In one particular raid on the southern coast of England, the Luftwaffe would suffer a 21% loss ratio of just over 100 Stukas. Occasional raids would continue into the new year of 1941, with Stukas sinking the HMS Tourmaline. The role of the aircraft at the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg attack would continue through the year, with 1941 being the last true year of glory for the Stuka. The new Ju-87R variants, R for range, wreaked havoc on Allied shipping in the Mediterranean, while both German and Italian Stukas routinely bombed the island of Malta. Stukas would also rain hell on Allied holdouts in North Africa, with minimal resistance from air attack. As a pre-runner to the invasion of the USSR in the June of the year, the Germans would invade the Balkans, while also supporting their Italian allies during their stalled invasion of Greece. Often, though, the landscape alone prevented the full force of a Blitzkrieg-style attack, as seen in France and Poland. Ju-87s would prove instrumental in knocking out desolate holdouts and having a damning effect on Allied shipping, ultimately forcing the Allies from the country. On the 22nd of June the same year, Germany would break its ties with the USSR and invade said country. The flat, long fields of the Ukraine would prove perfect for a swift German assault. Columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry would make incredible time, breaking through town after town with minimal Soviet resistance. With the Soviet Air Force, largely outdated and in much disarray, the Stukas, supported by Axis fighters, were largely flying free. This would be the last period in the conflict when the Stuka could fully fulfill its role. Through to the encirclement of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front, and the loss of North Africa to the newly engaging Americans, the Stuka would experience incredible losses, and would largely become replaced by faster and much more reliable aircraft, notably the Focke-Wulf 190F. Variants. During the war, the Luftwaffe would request multiple variants of the Ju-87 for various roles. Work began on the Ju-87D in the spring of 1941 to replace both the Ju-87B and R models, both of which were largely identical, with the only major difference being the addition of a higher fuel-carrying capacity on the latter. The Germans wanted a means of giving the aircraft more survivability. This was incredibly apparent following the severe losses of the aircraft during the Battle of Britain at the hands of the Royal Air Force. The D would most notably feature the installation of a much larger cockpit canopy, not only boosting pilot vision, but also allowing the installation of dual 7.92mm machine guns in the rear of the aircraft, a massive improvement on the previous single machine gun. The bomb-carrying capabilities were nearly quadrupled, up to 4,000 pounds, 1,800 kilograms. The D-series would prove to be the base for all Stukas to follow. Variants included the D2, glider tug, which for all intents and purposes was just a D1 with a re-strengthened airframe, which would remain on the following D3. The D2 had originally been intended as a tropical variant of the D1, featuring much more cockpit armor, an upgrade which had been required for years. The D3 was the highlight of the Stuka in its original dive-bombing role. The D5 was built from the D3, featuring a redesigned airframe in the form of a 2-foot longer wingspan. The most notable upgrade was the addition of 20mm cannon to the wings, as a replacement for the much outdated two 7.92mm machine guns. This much improved the aircraft's ground attack capabilities. Ground attack was largely the direction the aircraft was heading. As Allied fighters improved, high-altitude dive-bombing attacks were becoming more and more dangerous. Possibly the most outlandish variant was the G, Tank Buster, Panzerknacker. Reusing airframes of both D1 and D3 Stukas, and installing dual 37mm cannons for tank-busting duty. The additions of higher caliber cannons onto aircraft was hardly uncommon during the war, with even the British Hurricane receiving a variant with dual 40mm cannons. The Ju-87G would prove instrumental alongside the Henschel HS-129 Duck during the Battle of Kursk. The Germans would go on to experiment with many ideas for their increasingly outdated bird. From tank busters to tugs, the Ju-87's coat covered many rows. The last major variant of the Stuka would come in the late war, seeing it being developed into a night fighter. With the awesome force of bombing each night from the Royal Air Force, the Germans were struggling to cope. Already veteran night fighters such as the Bf-110 and Ju-88 were struggling to deal with the hordes of big 4-engine bombers assaulting German towns and cities each night, and relief was needed. Germany was in an incredibly awkward position at this stage in the war, and although developing much more modern Nighthawks, with both improved radar, speeds and firepower, including even a variant of the famous Me-262 fighter jet, it was much more easy to field outdated, largely obsolete aircraft such as the Stuka. Mostly D5s, although there was no single variant intended for use as a night fighter, and the model could often vary. Fitted with dampeners and better radios and other night-use apparatus, were sent up to engage the mass of Allied bombers. Due to their poor rate of climb and general lack of power, they were rarely even able to climb up to the bomber stream, and if they did, they would provide easy prey for the escorting de Havilland mosquitoes. It goes to show the insanity of late-war Germany that radar-equipped, night hunter intended and designed Bf-110s were being used to bomb tanks, while Ju-87s were being forced into the melee of late-night bomber hordes. Final. Today only 2 Stukas remain, one in the Royal Air Force Museum in London, and the second in the Chicago Museum of Industry.